For over a century, one name has been whispered in the shadows, a name that means terror, a name that stands for the ultimate unsolved mystery, Jack the Ripper. He was a ghost, a phantom, who stepped out of the London fog, wielded a knife with chilling skill, and simply vanished. He murdered at least 5 women on the grimy, gaslit streets of London, and in his wake, he left a legacy of fear, a city thrown into panic, and 1,000 theories. For 136 years, his identity has been the holy grail of true crime. We've pointed the finger at royals, doctors, artists, and immigrants. The world has obsessed over the who and the why. But what if every theory, every book, every documentary got it wrong? What if the one clue that could finally unmask this phantom has been sitting quietly, passed down through a family for generations, just waiting for the right moment and the right science to give up its secret? What if the answer was there all along, woven into a piece of fabric, stained with a victim's blood and the killer's own sins? We're going to journey from the terror-choked streets of 1888, Whitechapel, through the desperate and flawed police investigation that followed, and into the clean quiet of a modern laboratory, where the single most important piece of evidence in this century-old case was finally analyzed. This is the story of how science may have finally solved the unsolvable. To understand the monster, you first have to understand the world that made him. The year is 1888. London is the heart of the largest empire the world has ever seen, a city of incredible wealth, power, and progress. But in the city's East End, in a district called Whitechapel, it is a completely different story. This isn't the London of Queen Victoria's palaces. This is a labyrinth of despair. Picture streets, slick with a constant film of grime, the air thick with the stench of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the nearby slaughterhouses. The sky is a permanent, bruised gray. Overcrowded, filthy slums called rookeries lean on each other, their walls paper-thin, and their rooms crammed with entire families. One street was described at the time as perhaps the foulest and most dangerous street in the whole metropolis. Another, Dorset Street, was known simply as the worst street in London. This was a place of deep, grinding poverty. Robbery and violence were just part of the daily rhythm of life. For thousands, survival meant scraping together a few pennies for a bed in one of the 233 common lodging houses, where an estimated 8,500 people slept every night. These were doss houses, offering not much more than a straw mattress and a roof. In this desperate economy, many women had only one thing to sell: themselves. In October of 1888, the Metropolitan Police estimated there were 1,200 prostitutes working in Whitechapel alone, all of them living in a constant state of danger. This was a world ignored by the rest of society, a dark corner where the forgotten lived and died. The police who patrolled these streets were overwhelmed, understaffed, and treated with suspicion by the tight-lipped locals. This was a place where a person could disappear, where a cry in the night was easily ignored. It was the perfect hunting ground. And in the late summer of 1888, a predator began to stalk these dark, narrow streets. He would become a legend, but his legend would be written in the blood of the women who called this unforgiving place home. For more than a century, they've been known as the Canonical Five, a cold academic term for the women widely believed to be the victims of one killer. But they were more than a list. They were mothers, daughters, wives. They had hopes, and they had heartbreaks. They were human beings, dismissed in their time and overshadowed in death by their killer's fame. To understand the horror of Jack the Ripper, we have to remember them. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, but her friends called her Polly. Born in 1845, She was a blacksmith's daughter. She married a man named William Nichols, and they had 5 children. But the marriage fell apart under the strain of poverty and Polly's struggle with alcoholism. By 1888, she was 43, separated from her family and drifting between workhouses and the cold streets. Friends remembered her as cheerful, but on the night of August 30th, she was kicked out of a lodging house because she didn't have the 4 pence for a bed. She was last heard saying, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." In the pre-dawn hours of August 31st, her body was found in Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut twice, and her abdomen was brutally wounded. The autumn of terror had begun. Just over a week later, on September 8th, the killer struck again. Her name was Annie Chapman. Annie was 47, a widow who, like Polly, had fallen on hard times. She had 2 children, but had lost touch with them. Those who knew her described her as intelligent, but she too fought a battle with alcohol. She was known to sell handmade crochet items and flowers to earn a few coins. In the early morning, her body was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The violence had escalated. Her throat was severed so deeply, her head was almost detached, and her abdomen had been laid open. This time the killer had taken a trophy. Her uterus had been removed with surgical precision. The city began to panic. This wasn't random violence. This was a calculating hunter. The terror hit a fever pitch on September 30th, a night that became known as the double event. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old from Sweden. Elizabeth's life in London had unraveled into poverty and occasional sex work. Around 1 a.m., her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard. Her throat was cut, but unlike the others, there were no other mutilations. The police believed the killer must have been interrupted. That theory was confirmed just 45 minutes later, and less than a mile away. Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. She was 46 and in a long-term relationship. That night she'd been arrested for public drunkenness and was released at 1 a.m., right around the time Elizabeth Stride's body was being found. When her body was discovered, the mutilations were horrific. Her throat was cut, her face disfigured, and her abdomen ripped open. Her left kidney and a large part of her uterus had been taken by the killer. 2 murders in one night. The city was in the grip of a madman. The last canonical victim suffered the most horrifying fate. Mary Jane Kelly was different. She was young, just 25, and considered attractive. She was born in Ireland and eventually found her way to a small single room at 13 Miller's Court. Unlike the other victims, she wasn't killed on the street. The killer went home with her. On the morning of November 9th, her landlord sent someone to collect overdue rent. Peering through the window, he saw a scene of unimaginable carnage. Mary Jane Kelly's body was on the bed, but it was barely recognizable as human. She had been mutilated beyond description. Her organs were placed around the room, and her heart had been taken from the scene. The brutality stunned even the most hardened police of Victorian London. And then, after the horror of Miller's Court, the murders just stopped. The phantom who terrorized a city for 10 weeks melted back into the fog. He left behind 5 murdered women, a city forever scarred, and a question that would echo for more than a century. Who was Jack the Ripper? As the body count rose, the London police force found itself facing a nightmare. The Jack the Ripper investigation would become one of the largest manhunts in history, a desperate fight against an enemy who was always one step ahead. The inquiry was led by the Metropolitan Police's H Division in Whitechapel, but soon Scotland Yard sent its best detectives, including the renowned Inspector Frederick George Aberline. In total, more than 2,000 people were interviewed, over 300 were investigated, and 80 were detained. But the police were fighting a war against the limits of their own time. In 1888, modern forensics didn't exist. Fingerprinting was still 13 years away from being used by Scotland Yard. Crime scene photography wasn't standard. Systematically collecting trace evidence like hair or fibers was unheard of. They had to rely on basic observation, autopsies, and conflicting witness statements. It was all shoe leather detective work, knocking on doors and questioning the hundreds of locals who populated Whitechapel's dark streets. The environment itself was an enemy. Whitechapel was a maze of unlit alleys and courtyards, giving a killer endless ways to escape. The population was transient and deeply distrustful of police, creating a wall of silence that stopped the investigation in its tracks. Then came the media. The sensationalist newspapers seized on the story, fueling public hysteria with lurid headlines. This led to one of the most infamous parts of the case. The letters. Hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer flooded police stations and news agencies. Most were cruel hoaxes, but one, dated September 25th, would define the case. It started with the chillingly casual greeting, "Dear Boss." The author taunted the police, and for the first time, gave himself a name. The letter was signed, Jack the Ripper. The name stuck. It was terrifying and instantly iconic. The press published the letter, and the name Jack the Ripper was burned into history. While most experts now believe the Dear Boss letter was a hoax, likely written by a journalist to sell papers, another piece of mail wasn't so easy to dismiss. On October 16th, George Lusk, the head of a local citizens patrol group, received a small package. Inside was a letter that started with the words "from hell," and with it was half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits. The letter claimed the author had fried and eaten the other half. Medical examination determined it was a human kidney, likely from a woman of about 45 who suffered from Bright's disease, a condition Catherine Eddowes had. It was terrifying, but it was still not a clue that led them any closer to an arrest. The police were drowning. Every lid went cold. The killer was, as one paper put it, a phantom in the fog. After the butchery of Mary Jane Kelly in November 1888, the murders stopped. The case went cold. The police had failed. Jack the Ripper had vanished, leaving behind a bloody legacy and a gallery of ghouls, the men who for over a century would be suspected of being the monster. With the killer gone and the case unsolved, a morbid parlor game began that has lasted for over 130 years. Naming the Ripper, the list of suspects is huge and varied, ranging from the plausible to the absolutely bizarre. One of the earliest and most prominent suspects, even favored by some top police officials, was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher from a respectable family. His life took a dark turn in 1888. He was fired from his job for unknown reasons, and just weeks after the final murder, his body was pulled from the River Thames, a clear suicide. The timing was incredibly suspicious, and his own family supposedly believed he was the killer. But there was no direct evidence, and some records suggest he wasn't even in London during some of the murders. Then there was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born con man and thief. He was also on the police's short list, described as a homicidal maniac. But Ostrog was mainly a fraudster, not a violent killer. And crucially, records later showed he was likely in a French prison during the Autumn of Terror. Over the years, the list just got stranger. Some pointed to the artist Walter Sickert, who was fascinated with London's dark side. The crime novelist Patricia Cornwell has famously spent millions trying to prove this, but the evidence remains unconvincing to most historians. Another theory, one that really captured the public's imagination, pointed right to the top. Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, and grandson of Queen Victoria. The theory goes that the murders were part of a royal cover-up. But there is solid evidence that Prince Eddie was nowhere near London when the murders happened. It's a sensational theory, but not a credible one. The list goes on. There was Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who hated women. There was George Chapman, a Polish immigrant hanged for poisoning 3 of his wives, who was reportedly Inspector Aberline's favorite suspect. There was even a theory about a Jill the Ripper, maybe a midwife who could walk bloody streets without raising suspicion. Each suspect had a compelling story, but that's all it ever was. A story. The mystery lasted because there was no smoking gun, no hard proof, that is, until an author bought a piece of history at an auction, a simple silk shawl that had been waiting patiently for its story to be told. This case has spawned more theories than almost any other, from doctors to royalty. Everyone has a favorite suspect. Before we dive into the science that might finally have an answer, I want to hear from you. Who is your top Jack the Ripper suspect, and why? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this journey into London's dark past, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. For 125 years, the Ripper mystery was a puzzle with a missing piece. Then, in 2007, that piece may have finally turned up at an auction. It was a large silk shawl, patterned with Michaelmas daisies. According to the seller, this was no ordinary shawl. This was a silent witness. But this is where the story gets complicated. The shawl's journey, its provenance, is the first major hurdle. The story passed down through a family is that a police sergeant named Amos Simpson, who was on duty near the murder of Catherine Eddowes, took the shawl from the area. The critical detail is that there is no official police record from 1888 that ever mentions a shawl being found at the scene. This story comes entirely from the policeman's family. The story continues that his wife, a dressmaker, was horrified and refused to touch the blood-soaked fabric. So the shawl was packed away, unwashed, and passed down for generations. In 2007, it was purchased at auction by Russell Edwards, an author and amateur ripperologist. Edwards was determined to see if modern science could find an answer. He took the shawl to Dr. Jerry Llewellyn, an expert in analyzing genetic evidence from historical crime scenes. First, they examined the shawl itself. Analysis confirmed it was likely made in the early 19th century. Then, Llewellyn's team began the painstaking process of examining the stains. Using specialized photography, they found dark brown stains consistent with arterial blood spatter. But there were other stains too. Under UV light, different patches glowed, indicating the possible presence of seminal fluid. Now for the critical test. Could they get DNA from a piece of fabric over a century old? Using special techniques, Llewellyn's team extracted tiny fragments of genetic material. They focused on mitochondrial DNA, or MAT DNA. Unlike our unique nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA is passed down from a mother to her children. It can't identify one specific person, but it can definitively link someone to a maternal family line. They needed a comparison. They tracked down a living female descendant of Catherine Eddowes, a woman named Karen Miller. They took a sample of her DNA. When they compared the MAT DNA from the bloodstains on the shawl to Karen Miller's DNA, they had a match. This was an incredible moment. It didn't prove the shawl's origin story, but it did prove, with a high degree of certainty, that it had been in contact with Catherine Eddowes' blood. But the most electrifying discovery was still to come. The team turned to the DNA from the suspected semen stains. If they could find a familial match for this, they might just unmask the Ripper. And there was one name from the original police files that had always stood out. The investigation now focused on one of the original police suspects, a man named Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who had fled persecution and settled in Whitechapel. At the time of the murders, he was a 23-year-old barber, living right in the middle of the murder locations, and he was on the police's radar. A police memo written years later named Kosminski as a key suspect, noting he had a great hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies. He was a man plagued by severe mental illness. His behavior grew more and more erratic. He suffered from hallucinations and paranoia. In 1891, just a few years after the Ripper murders stopped, Kosminski was institutionalized, and he remained in asylums for the rest of his life. He was a local man. He worked with blades. He had a documented hatred for the women being targeted, and the murders stopped when he was committed. He was a prime suspect, but for 125 years, there was no physical evidence. That's what Dr. Luhalanen's lab was for. The team needed a DNA sample from Kosminski's maternal line. In an incredible piece of detective work, they located a living female descendant of Aaron Kosminski's sister, who agreed to provide a DNA sample. Now the stage was set. They sequenced the mtDNA from the cells in the suspected seminal stains on the shawl. They then sequenced the mtDNA from the living descendant of Kosminski. The result? It was a match. The mitochondrial DNA from the shawl shared a direct maternal link with Aaron Kosminski. The science was pointing to one conclusion: DNA linked to Aaron Kosminski's family line was on the shawl, a shawl that was also stained with the blood of Catherine Eddowes. In 2019, the findings were published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Forensic Sciences. It was the first time physical evidence linking a suspect to the Ripper crimes had ever been published in a serious academic journal. The study also noted that other genetic markers suggested the owner had brown hair and brown eyes, which matched a description from one of the few eyewitnesses. It seemed the Phantom of Whitechapel was no longer a nameless ghoul. He wasn't royalty or a brilliant surgeon. He was a deeply disturbed young barber. The case for many was closed, but in the world of Ripperology, nothing is ever that simple. The announcement sent shockwaves through the true crime community, but for many experts, it wasn't the final truth. It was just another theory, built on a foundation that might not be as solid as it seems. Serious questions and criticisms quickly emerged. The biggest challenge is the shawl itself. The entire case hangs on this one piece of fabric. As we mentioned, there's no official police record of it existing in 1888. Its entire story relies on family lore. Over 130 years, it was handled by many people. Critics argue the risk of contamination is massive. Could Kosminski's DNA have gotten on the shawl at any point in the last century? Absolutely. Then there's the DNA itself. Remember, the study used mitochondrial DNA. It can prove a maternal family link, but it can't pinpoint an individual. The DNA match means it could have come from Aaron Kosminski, but it also could have come from his mother, his sister, or any number of his maternal relatives. Some geneticists have also argued that the specific genetic sequence found is actually quite common among people of European descent, a claim the study's authors dispute. Furthermore, many scientists criticized the 2019 study because it didn't publish the full DNA sequences. The authors cited the privacy of the living descendants, but critics argue that you can't make such a huge historical claim without allowing other scientists to independently check your work. The debate rages on. Those who believe the findings point to all the evidence lining up: the DNA match, the eyewitness description, Kosminski's profile, his location, and his status as a prime suspect back in 1888. To them, the case is incredibly strong. But critics say that without a clear documented chain of custody for the shawl, and with the known limitations of maybe DNA, the verdict on Aaron Kosminski has to be not proven. It's the strongest case ever presented, but it may not be the final word. Our journey took us from the squalid alleys of Victorian London into the bright, sterile world of 21st century genetics. For 136 years, the identity of Jack the Ripper was a ghost story. Then came the shawl, and the DNA evidence pointing to Aaron Kosminski is, without a doubt, the biggest breakthrough in the history of the case. It transforms Kosminski from just a name on a list into the most plausible suspect we've ever had. We have a piece of physical evidence from a crime scene, bearing the DNA of the victim and a maternal link to a man who fits the profile perfectly. And yet, that shadow of doubt remains. The questions about where the shawl came from and the limits of the DNA evidence mean the case can't be slammed shut. Perhaps that's the ultimate legacy of Jack the Ripper. The passage of time has not only degraded the evidence, but also our ability to ever be 100% sure. So, have we solved the unsolvable? The answer is, maybe. We have unmasked the most likely face of the Ripper. We have given a name to the phantom, Aaron Kosminski, a troubled, violent man lost to history. But the legend of Jack the Ripper has always been as much about the mystery as the man. The final truth may be that we now know who he almost certainly was, but the chilling power of his story, the ghost that haunted London's fog, will likely never fade away. The debate over the Kosminski evidence is going to continue for years. What do you think? Does the DNA evidence close the case for you? Or do the questions about the shawl leave too much room for doubt? I want to read all of your theories and thoughts in the comments section. This was a deep dive into one of history's greatest mysteries. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into the most fascinating corners of the past. Thank you for watching.